But let me move on. Come to the fourth commandment, verse 8. Fourth commandment, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Now, when we come to this commandment, probably once again, we have almost a sort of a knee-jerk reaction. We say, oh yeah, that's the one that doesn't have anything to do with us. 9 of them are repeated in the New Testament in some way or other is still applying to us, but that one is never applied to us in the New Testament. Well, it is true that we're never told to observe the Sabbath day, like the Jews observed the Sabbath day in the New Testament. That's absolutely correct. And there's been a long history of, Christians somehow trying to read the Sabbath into the New Testament in some way or other. And in many cases, that has involved trying to take Sunday and say, well, Sunday is the Christian Sabbath. And, of course, the Seventh-day Adventists just have a field day with that. They say, that's the most silly thing. Where in the world did you get this Sunday is the Christian Sabbath? That's just something made up by the Roman Catholic Church. And you know what? They're right about that. The fact of the matter is that is something just made up by man. So that probably is our first reaction to say, yeah, that one doesn't have anything to do with us because we don't have to observe the Sabbath. Well and good so far. At least as far as saying we don't observe the Sabbath as not work on Saturday or try to impute that to the Lord's Day. But having said that, I think we make a great mistake if we say this doesn't have anything to do with us. In many ways, in fact, I would suggest that perhaps more than any other of the 10 commandments, this one points to the salvation that we have in Christ. What was that Sabbath law all about anyway? I could do a whole sermon on this, probably have. But the Sabbath was a little bit of rest that God gave the children of Israel. They got to rest from their labors one day a week. Now, the Jews made a great mistake over the course of their history. They came to observe that primarily as a great burden. Kind of like where you start thinking about God's laws just primarily as something, don't make a mistake about this one. And they came to spend most of their time trying to figure out exactly what would constitute work and how they could be sure they didn't break the Sabbath, and they forgot all about what it was really for. As Jesus reproached them, he said they'd forgotten that man was not made for the Sabbath, but the Sabbath for man. It was not intended as a penalty on man, it was intended as a blessing for man, the Sabbath was. It was a day of rest. What was it? It was a day when they got to rest from the burdens that man endures because of sin. Specifically, they got to rest from work. Man began to work because of sin. The Sabbath was a little window of salvation, a little window, one day a week, a little foretaste of what it would be like to have the burdens of this world lifted from off our shoulders. And in that, it pointed to the coming of Jesus Christ, and ultimately pointed to the Sabbath rest of heaven itself. And if we have more time, I'd say, let's go over to Hebrews chapter 4, and you would find the statement made there that we, through Jesus Christ, enter into that Sabbath rest. And that there remains a keeping of Sabbath for the people of God. It's not talking about a weekly keeping of the Sabbath on the order of the Jews. It's talking about the fulfillment, the real rest that those Sabbaths pointed to. The rest that we have in Jesus Christ. We have now, by faith, in promise of salvation. We have ultimately in the rest of heaven itself. And so, yeah, it's true, we don't keep the Sabbath. But to say that this doesn't have anything to do with us, no, this is a type of law that is made by God who is preparing salvation for His people. And it teaches us something about the plan that God had in His mind for His people. And that is, He was preparing a Sabbath rest. He was preparing deliverance for His people. And that's the God that we worship. Well, let's go on. The fifth commandment. The fifth commandment in verse 12. Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be prolonged in the land which the Lord your God gives you. There are many things that this commandment suggests to me about God. I think it suggests something to us about the nature of God as our Father and His calling us, His children. But it also suggests to me that the family relationship is sacred to God. God, who gives a commandment like this, cares about families. He cares about the relationship between parents and their children. And one of the popular notions in our world today is, you can make a family any way you want to. If you've only got a woman and her children, that's a perfectly normal family. I'll grant that there are circumstances where that's the best that can be done under the circumstances and well according to God's will. but it doesn't match God's original plan. Others want to say, well, a couple of men can make just as good a family, or a couple of women can make just as good a family as what God originally designed. The God who made this law, honor your father and mother, is the God who created the family. And he cares about that, and I would suggest that the family relationship is sacred to God. And we tinker with it only if we disregard the God who made it. The sixth commandment, you shall not commit murder. The Hebrew word that's used right here would suggest probably not just killing in the sense of execution, different words actually for that, but what we would think of as murder. Well, what's the point? What type of God makes a law like this? God doesn't say, you shall not commit murder because somebody might kill you. I think civil law in our society, that's the main reason you don't commit murder. Not because there is something sacred about life, but rather people just debate about, if you commit murder, or under what circumstances might it be justified even. The basic point is simply, you don't commit murder because it would lead to anarchy in society and things would get out of control. God doesn't give any explanations like that. It just says, you shall not commit murder. And I would suggest that the reason is grounded in the very nature of God himself. God is the author of life. Death is a result of sin. Murder is taking away life that God, the author of life, has given. And it's an affront to God himself as the creator and the giver of life. And what he teaches us, what it reveals about the nature of God, is not just that he is the living God, but that he is the God of life. And anything that would kill that which God has given that life to, given that life in his own image. God says later that such a person was himself worthy of death. Human life is sacred to God. Death is the curse of sin. The seventh commandment, you shall not commit adultery. Not only is the family relationship sacred to God, but the marriage relationship is sacred to God. And indeed, God not only uses the image of the father and his children with relationship to the family and the fifth commandment, but also the relationship of husband and wife to describe his relationship to us. He speaks of the children of Israel as his wife who had been unfaithful to him. And in the New Testament, we read of Christ and the church as the bride of Christ. The marriage relationship is sacred to God, and I would suggest likewise that covenants are sacred to God, because marriage is indeed a covenant. When people make vows, make those vows before God. Those are sacred before God. And the God of the Bible is a God who expects those things to be treated as holy and sacred. The eighth commandment, you shall not steal. I think I'll probably, by and large, pass over this because it takes me longer to explain it than we have, but it doesn't take long to explain what it means not to steal. But what does it reveal about God? But I would suggest that it suggests something that people today generally, at least in intellectual circles in our society, is considered kind of lowbrow, and that is the idea that property rights are sacred to God. Sort of the idea today is that everything belongs to everybody, and that stealing's not necessarily really stealing. It may just be redistribution of wealth or something of that nature. And God does not approach it that way. The ninth commandment, you shall not bear false witness. The truth is sacred to God. What does it tell us about God? God is the truth. God cannot lie. But I move quickly, in light of time, to the 10th and last commandment, you shall not covet. And I want to suggest that this commandment is especially important as well. I would ask you, just think for just a second. This commandment's different now. How is it different? It's different from all of the other ones that we have looked at. And I think in a way that teaches us something of extraordinary importance about God. What is covetousness? Probably the closest word that we commonly use is something like greediness. But it's greediness that's associated with seeing something that your neighbor or someone around you has and you want that. Usually it's not just you want one like it, you want that one as well. That's covetousness. Now, the point is this. Covetousness, what does it lead somebody to do? If you covet something, you will lie, steal, cheat, kill, maybe even to get it. Those are the ways in which the covetous heart expresses itself. But God had already said you don't do those things. You covet your neighbor's wife, you don't commit adultery. You covet his donkey, you don't steal it. Thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not steal. The ways in which covetousness expresses itself have already been covered. But here he still says, don't covet. What does that tell us about God? It tells us that the God we worship and serve is not just concerned about what we actually do. He's concerned about the attitude of heart. He's concerned about what is in our heart that led us to do it. And when Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount that it's not just if you kill that's a matter of concern to God, but it's whether or not you hate your brother in your heart. When he says it's not just if you commit adultery, it's whether you look on the woman to lust after. When he says those things, he's telling us something that we really ought to have known about God all along. That God doesn't just care what we do, he ultimately cares most about what is in our hearts. And the fact that we may or may not be successful in carrying the sins of our heart to fruition doesn't mean that God is unconcerned about it.